the introduction. Thank you both for inviting me. I'm kind of moved to be back to Athens, to meet so many friends and comrades who remind me of a different, although not far, time in which we had the impression to be on the offensive, to be able to challenge the neoliberal order in Greece and in Europe. I'm honored to deliver this memorial lecture in the name of Nikos Pulantza. I even heard that he had a chance to lecture in this room many years ago. I'm not a Pulantza's scholar. I'm not a Pulantzacian, but over the last decades, I had many occasions to engage in his work, and all these occasions were linked to very important experiences of the left in this new century. I'm thinking, of course, of the Greek crisis, of the first Syriza government, of the rise of Podemos in Spain, but also of the so-called new progressive governments in Latin America. In particular, in Bolivia, due to the work of Álvaro García Linera, Pulantza was a very important theoretical and political reference for the building of popular power during the government of the movement to socialism. This means that Pulantza is, for me, associated with some of the most important political experiences of the left in recent years. His name is kind of politicized, and I don't forget the fact that the political experiences I quickly refer to were, of course, completely different from the experiences that were the basis for the formulation of Pulantza's theory in the 1960s and 1970s. There is a kind of temporal gap, a kind of temporal disjuncture I would like to continue to make productive in this lecture. Fascism, imperialism, and power will provide me with the conceptual and political threads for a kind of belated dialogue with Pulantza, in which I will focus more on the problematics that he foreshadowed than on his solutions and concrete proposals. While doing that, I will, of course, keep in mind the kind of predicament, the kind of conjuncture of war, the rise of new forces of the right that define our current condition. So let me start with fascism. And let me start by saying that fascism is in the air and that this is not a short-term phenomenon. One could even say that in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we have witnessed a steady rise of all the new forces of the right at the global level. Think of Modi in India, of Erdogan in Turkey, of Trump's first presidential election in 2016, of Bolsonaro in Brazil, of the multifarious forms of the far right in Eastern and Western Europe. These instances are, of course, highly heterogeneous. Yet we can draw on Pulantza's here, who encourages us, I quote, to abandon once and for all the conception of a unified and uniform fascist discourse of language addressed indistinctly to the masses, end of quote. I think we should extend this insight of Pulantza's beyond the analysis of a single instance of fascism and toward the much needed attempt to map the heterogeneous forms taken by fascism in global presence. If I use the word fascism to grasp some key characteristics of today's far-right movements, I remain, of course, aware of the differences with historical fascism, which have led, for instance, the Italian historian Enzo Traverso to speak of post-fascism. And in particular, I keep in mind the criticism of historical analogy articulated by Alberto Toscano in his book Late Fascism, as well as his invitation, Toscano's invitation, to see what happens, what we can learn when we project theories of fascism onto the present. In a way, the combination Toscano highlights of a selective anti-statism with a revanchist ethno-nationalism passionately attached to the symbolism and reality of the repressive state bears clear fascist traces, which need to be accounted for against the background of a widespread reaction against certain aspects of the neoliberal moment, its globalism in particular. And it is no paradox, it is a constitutive aspect of our current condition that this reaction against certain aspects of the neoliberal moment ends up reaffirming and entrenching other aspects of the neoliberal logic, such as entrepreneurialism, albeit with a pronounced authoritarian twist. Late fascist movements are deeply defined by their selective relation with neoliberalism, while the emphasis on the repressive state operates in tandem with efforts to disarticulate the political system, including established systems of rights, liberties, and guarantees, in the name of radical forms of nationalism. I think it is important to keep in mind this very general definition of the fascist traits of contemporary movements of the far right, as well as the critique of historical analysis, while addressing Nίκου Pulantza's most important book on fascism, which means fascism and dictatorship, that came out in 1970. This book is an in-depth study of historical fascism in Italy and in Germany. Although we can guess that the main motivation behind the writing of the book was Pulantza's need to come to grips with the military coup in Greece in 1967. The theoretical framework of Pulantza's analysis was shaped by his engagement with classical Marxist theories of fascism, and in particular with the Third International's policy towards it. I will not discuss in detail this theoretical framework. I will rather focus on a couple of points in Pulantza's book that seem to me to be relevant for our present. First of all, Pulantza describes fascism as a delayed counter-revolution. Its rise, its seizure of power happens after the defeat of the working class in Germany and in Italy. And the fascist seizure of power opens a time in which profoundly destabilized societies and economies are violently reshaped and synchronized around the hegemony of the monopoly capital. In this sense, you can say that fascism, historical fascism, played for Pulantza a kind of modernizing role, inscribing Italy and Germany onto the imperialist chain at the highest level of capitalism in the wake of the First World War. What is important to note is that, according to Pulantza, in doing that, precisely because of the failure of socialists and in particular communist parties to come to grips with the defeat of the working class, fascism was able to perform a kind of, I quote Pulantza's, corrupted ideological recuperation of deep-seated popular aspirations, turning them onto tools for a politics aligned with the interests of big capital. So a belated counter-revolution that was able to recuperate, although in corrupted forms, deep-seated popular ambitions and aspirations. I think that under completely different historical conditions, there is much to learn from Pulantza's analysis today. Sure, we didn't have in recent years around the world something similar to the Spartakist uprising in 1918-19 in Germany, or to the Red Biennium 1919-1920 in Italy. And even more importantly, we did not have anything comparable to the Soviet revolution in recent decades. Nonetheless, the first 2 decades of the 21st century have been characterized by a spectacular proliferation of uprisings, riots, and popular struggles in many parts of the world. And this is a fact we tend too often to forget, I think. So from Argentina to Chile, from Hong Kong to Turkey, from Greece to Egypt, we have been witnessing an amazing continuity of insurgencies, with a multitude of exploited and dominated figures, subjective figures, rising up in search of liberation. So without delving into the specifics in each case, we can follow Vincent Bevin in his If We Burn, when he contends that the overall result of these movements was a missing revolution, or more generally, a missing radical transformation of the present state of things. So letting Pulantza's theory of fascism resonate in our present compels us to take seriously the intensity of social struggles and insurgencies over the last 25 years as the backdrop for the rise of a new fascism. And we must pay attention to the multifarious ways in which a new fascist force has been able, in many places, to ideologically recuperate, albeit in a corrupted form, popular aspirations that have nurtured radical politics in previous years. This is quite evident, I think, in particular in the specific fascist understanding of freedom that characterizes late fascist movements. White fantasies, racial ghosts, and nationalist imaginations of a bounded community threatened by multifarious others spur and surround today the spread of such a freedom, in which we can see both a reversal and a negation of the search for new forms of life, liberated from the rule of capital, that have shaped the movements and struggles of the past decades. More generally, I was quite struck by reading a short book by Rodrigo Nunes on Bolsonarism in Brazil. What Nunes writes is that we live in times in which there is a widespread awareness of the fact that it is not possible to go ahead as usual, that capitalism can no longer offer a viable horizon for the future, while simultaneously lacking any clear and viable alternative. I think that late fascism proliferates in its heterogeneous forms within this field of tension, in which we can discern both the persistent influence of past struggles and the effects of their defeat or failure. Time appears as to be suspended or deferred here, and apocalyptical fantasies which abound in the imaginaries of the far right are far from taking the form of a fascist utopia. They simply end up nurturing the reproduction of class rule and the capital relation in even more unrestrained forms. And this is not a peaceful and smooth process. It is always literally or metaphorically made possible by violence. So let us repeat that the present forms of fascism, in all their variants, are very different from the ones of the 1920s and 1930s. Parties continue to have important roles to play, but the imagined community projected by fascist politics and sustaining its reproduction is based on experiences of radical individualism and disintermediation of social experience, which are reorganized within new digital media environments. The blurred and dusty shape of the fascist crowd today appears like a ghostly reversal, and again, like a negation of the multitude that many of us have described as the new political figure of class in contemporary capitalism. And I think this is a point in which we need to take a different point of view with respect to Pulantza's. Pulantza's analysis was very much focused on the fascist regime. It took from the Italian philosopher, fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile, the word statolatry. And maybe this concept allowed him to provide a compelling analysis of the working of fascism in Germany and particularly in Italy. But what about today? I think that today it is necessary to shift the analytical focus from the regime to the movement, precisely to understand how is it possible that a fascist subjectivity becomes such a powerful force. So to put it very quickly, I do not see any fascist state today, while I see a proliferation of fascist movements in many parts of the world. And I repeat, as a prominent Marxist state theorist, Pulantza was primarily interested in shedding light on the peculiar characteristics of the fascist state. He describes the fascist state as an exceptional capitalist state. And he emphasizes very much that in the conjuncture of the 1930s, this state had to be an interventionist state, able to reorganize society and economy around the primacy, the hegemony of big monopoly capitalism. I repeat, this may be considered as a compelling analysis of historical fascism. But what about today? Are the movements that bear clear fascist characteristics foreshadowing full-fledged plans to reorganize what Pulantza calls the whole state system, positioning it at the center of capitalist development and social life? I doubt it. What we see in many parts of the world is definitely the attempt to destabilize existing political systems through wild attacks on what is called in the US the deep state or on the political caste. However, when fascist movements seize power, the governments they establish are hybrid formations that combine at different degrees neoliberal rhetorics, authoritarian measures, economic and cultural nationalism, celebration of quote and unquote freedom, and racial as well as gender fantasies of restoration. The list could easily go on. There are, of course, differences, say, between Milei and Trump, but the list doesn't lead, I think, to the emergence of the profile of a fascist state. There is, therefore, a gap between late fascist movements and the regimes they contribute to establish. This is also because the boundary between the political, the social, and the economic dimensions of those movements appear to be blurred. The spread of entrepreneurialism is one of the main characteristics of the anatomy of contemporary fascism and builds the backdrop for the articulation of religious imaginaries, desires of order, and so-called post-truth. More generally, the working of capitalism today is far from requiring the coordination and steering by an overarching interventionist state. It rather tends to reshape public structures and institutions according to its own logic, as the kind of deal between Donald Trump, Musk, and big tech clearly shows in the United States. So what I am suggesting is that the emerging assemblage of capital and power cannot be equated with the fascist state conceptualized by Pulantza as an exceptional capitalist state, even though it may be supported by movements whose fascist traits are apparent. These movements, however, are clearly compatible with this assemblage of capital and power, since it is already operative within their very constitution. So while historical fascisms were eminently political formations, embodying what George Mosse calls a new political style in the age of the nationalization of the masses, late fascist movements are traversed and shaped by the operative logic of contemporary capital in its technological and financial manifestations. The challenge for the left, I think it's a big challenge, is to struggle against these late fascist movements on the very terrain where they thrive, working to build the social and political power necessary to confront both late fascist movements and capital in its current formation. It remains true in this respect that there is no anti-fascism without anti-capitalism. Let me come now to a second aspect of Pulantza's analysis of fascism in his 1970 book that seems to me to be relevant in the present. I am thinking of the link Pulantza establishes between fascism and transition, between fascism and the crucial transition within capitalism, which means the transition to monopoly capitalism. As many of you will remember, Pulantza says that this transition had been interrupted both in Italy and in Germany, and that there was a need to accelerate the transition with authoritarian means. This is basically the role of fascism in Pulantza's analysis, to compel, to accelerate kind of interrupted transition within capital. I think this is a point that we should reframe in our current condition. Since, at least since the 1970s, we have been living in a situation characterized by a series of transitions within capitalism. The end of Fordism introduced decades characterized by an unaccomplished transition that has been kind of conceptualized within the left by critical scholars in many different ways. I think it is productive to work with the hypothesis that the rise of new fascist movements in different parts of the world can act as a factor to accelerate and relatively stabilize this transition. A transition that leads to the reorganization of capitalism around the dominance of specific fractions of capital, which means big tech and logistical actors on the one hand, finance on the other hand. Let me come now to the question of imperialism. I will be a bit quick for want of time, but then we can discuss about it after my talk. This transition to monopoly capitalism was for Pulantza's a close reader of Lenin, also a transition to the imperialist stage of capitalism. And this is why he famously modifies Max Horkheimer's dictum of fascism and capitalism, writing that, I quote, "It is he who does not wish to discuss imperialism who should stay silent on the subject of fascism." There is no need now to discuss in detail Pulantza's analysis of the relation between fascism and imperialism. What matters more for me, and I think for us, is again a principle of method, which means the need to combine an analysis of the internal dynamics of fascism with an attention, with a constant attention to the tensions and conflicts at the level of world politics and at the global scale of capital accumulation. I think this is an urgent task today, as it was in the 1930s. Part and parcel of the current transitions of capitalism is indeed the proliferation of fractures within the world systems, which also means within the world market. and it is in this conjuncture that the issue of imperialism becomes again crucial for us. As you know, Pulantza wrote quite extensively on imperialism in the early 1970s in particular. If you read the introduction to fascism and dictatorship, Pulantza, in order to explain the urgency and political necessity of his book, writes that, I quote, "It is now becoming increasingly clear that imperialism is passing through a major worldwide crisis." End of quote. So which are the causes of this major crisis for Pulantza? First of all, there is a need to stress that in several writings, Pulantza was highlighting the novel characteristics of US-American imperialism and hegemony with respect to other imperialism in history. And to put it very quickly, again for want of time, what Pulantza demonstrates in his writings on imperialism is that there is a powerful tendency toward the unification of the imperialist system at the level of the world market. Of course, in the 1970s, there was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union posed a limit, a relative limit to this process. But the process was very powerful, and Pulantza criticized the positions within debates on imperialism that were focused on the possibility of the emergence of counter-imperialism within the Western bloc. So this was the first important aspect of Pulantza's writings on imperialism, a powerful tendency to the unification of the imperialist system. Due to this tendency, imperialism was becoming internal to the economic, social, and political dynamics of peripheral as well as metropolitan formations. And from this point of view, Pulantza criticizes the understanding of the theory of state monopoly capitalism that was prevailing in the French Communist Party, saying that the new conjuncture of imperialism was erasing the space for the existence of a national bourgeoisie, was erasing the space for democratic dynamics writ large. A last important point in Pulantza's analysis of imperialism emerges once we come back to his point regarding a major general crisis of imperialism in the 1970s, which was the cause of this crisis. Pulantza is very clear. It is not the emergence of counter-imperialist powers. It is the power of struggles. It is the power of popular struggles both in the periphery and in the metropolis. Well, I think that if you take together these different aspects of Pulantza's writings on imperialism, you get a clear image the conjuncture of the 1970s. Needless to say, this conjuncture changed quite quickly in the following years, and particularly in the wake of the end of actually existing socialism. Sure, in the 1990s, we had a relatively short moment of enchantment when we were kind of struck by the image of an emerging unitary empire under the dominance of the United States. But it was a relatively short moment of enchantment. In the new century, it became clear that as Giovanni Arrighi and Immanuel Wallerstein contended already in the early 1990s, we were rather confronted with a turbulent, incipient crisis of the US global hegemony. And in this situation, the question of imperialism emerges, taking different characteristics with respect to the conjuncture analyzed by Pulantza's in the 1970s. Nonetheless, I think that Pulantza's emphasis on the powerful process, the powerful tendency toward the unification of the imperialist system continues to retain its validity nowadays, and what we should urgently try to do is precisely to think together the persistence of this tendency toward unification and the proliferation of fractures that take the form of wars. Let me conclude saying something about Pulantza's classical topic, which means the theory of power and state. I will not discuss the most prominent and best known points in Pulantza's theory of the state. I will rather follow the thread of his analysis of fascism and of imperialism. Because what unifies Pulantza's analysis of fascism and imperialism is an emphasis on the weakness and crisis of democracy. Of course, fascism is the negation of democracy. Imperialism, as I was saying, poses serious limits to democratic dynamics. And in a way, I think we should start again from this analysis of the weakness and the crisis of democracy that, of course, takes today very different characteristics. I was thinking while preparing this lecture of a series of essays written in the early 1980s in prison by Tony Negri. In these essays, Negri develops the notion of crisis state to analyze how the state is beginning to internalize and reproduce the crisis to enable new forms of capitalist development that no longer rely on a dialectical relationship between workers of popular struggles and capital. This dialectical relationship between struggles and capital, he added, is constitutive of democracy, while its rupture is a key aspect of fascism. In a way, we continue to live in a situation in which the dialectic between capital and labor is interrupted. And I think we have to ask fundamental questions about the ways in which we can reframe a radical left politics in a conjunction in which we are indeed confronted with the proliferation of struggles, forms of resistance, seemingly unable to produce institutional crystallizations and therefore cycles of accumulation of power. It is from this point of view that rereading Pulantza's last book, State, Power, Socialism, 1978, can provide us with conceptual and political openings that, although fragmentary, remain important for us today. In this book, you can note a kind of rebound of boomerang effect of Pulantza's well-known criticism of Michel Foucault, in the sense that Pulantza's concepts in this book bear the traces of not only a criticism of Foucault, but also of an appropriation of some of Foucault's analysis. And this is true, first of all, for the ultimate dismissal of any essentialist definition of the state, the kind of definition that had nurtured and continues to nurture specific forms of state fetishism in and beyond Marxism. So I will again, for want of time, not go into the details of Pulantza's analysis in this book. Of course, we have to read this book remaining aware of the context. Because 1978, there was the big discussion on Eurocommunism in the Western European communist parties, and Pulantza participates in this discussion, and he has the aim to get rid of the Marxist-Leninist rhetoric and even political legacy that was so strong in the Communist Party in France. It is from this point of view that he criticizes the theory of dual power. But in a way, he also contributes to a possible rethinking of the very notion of dual power, insisting on the absolute relevance to combine the struggle within the institutions with, I quote, a struggle outside the institutions and apparatuses, giving rise to a whole series of instruments, means of coordination, organs of popular power at the base, structures of direct democracy. I think that this struggle outside the institutions and apparatuses appears even more important today when the dialectics with the struggle within the state appears to be interrupted. And while I speak and I think of this possible reframing of the theory of dual power, I realize that I am using words that I spoke and wrote in July 2015, after the referendum in Greece and the agreement with the Troika of creditors. This is not to say I was right, which is apparently not the case. It is rather to remind that the sketch of a new theory of dual power that I just provided is not so different from the way in which I tried with many others to make sense of the first Syriza government 10 years ago. And we were defeated. As Peter Braxis notes, the Greek struggle undoubtedly faced structural limits and obstacles, yet it failed even to render them visible as potential terrains of contestation. But allow me to conclude this talk with a bit of rhetoric, quoting the words of an Italian comrade who recently passed away, Franco Piperno, one of the most important leaders of the Italian 68, particularly in Rome, and then of the revolutionary organization Potere Operaio, Workers' Power. They will defeat us so many times, Franco used to say, that we will eventually learn to win. This also serves as a reminder that in any defeat there is something worth salvaging. And the virtuality and potency of an experience like the Greek one from 10 years ago continue to act as an incitement to invite new, more powerful tools for political transformation on the side of the exploited and dominated class. Thank you.
Σάντρο, σε ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για αυτή την εξαιρετική ομιλία και για την, ας πούμε, αισιόδοξη ενόραση για το μέλλον μας. Θα δώσω τώρα την διεύθυνση της συζήτησης που θα ακολουθήσει, εφόσον τη θέλουμε, στην Δέσποινα Παπαδοπούλου και ταυτόχρονα θα υπάρχει και ένα κουτί οικονομικής ενίσχυσης που θα περιφέρεται